there, and welcome to the Violin Geek podcast. I'm your host, Laurel Thomsen, and today we are going to be talking about the metronome, which I know inspires fear in many of us. So my hope is that by the end, you will have all these new creative ways that you can approach using the metronome, and you'll feel a lot more confident. There are different ways. It's not just the click, 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 and we have to be right. We have to be perfect, all of this that can definitely make us feel a little bit intimidated. But first, I wanted to just thank everyone who has checked out some of our music videos surrounding the latest album and maybe gone and streamed some of the tunes or bought one of our signed CDs, which we have been sending out lately to some far-flung places. It's been cool. We sent out some CDs to France and different places. So you can definitely go and check those out either by heading to my website, laurelthomsen.com, or the Dan and Laurel page, danandlaurel.ca. And the last couple of podcasts, we previewed a couple tracks from the new album After the Fire, but we'll be doing some more. And it's been really nice to be getting some radio play in the last couple of weeks since we released the album, as well as some press. And you just never know how things are going to turn out. You spend a lot of time by yourself creating something and then sort of send it out to the world, and it can be a scary process in doing that. You don't know how things are going to be received. And, we just hope that everything finds its fans. So the songs are finding their fans, and if you're one of them, that's wonderful. So the metronome. I have had the same metronome since I was about 16, and it's quite loud. That was my parameter for selecting a metronome. I went to the music store with my mom, and they had a bunch of metronomes. They had the kind of typical triangular metronomes that have the pendulum. They had lots of electronic ones. They had ones that were part of tuners, and they took them all down, and they said, well, this one has this feature and that one has that feature. And I said, which one's the loudest? Because I knew if I wasn't going to be able to hear it over the violin that is right up next to my ear, then it probably wasn't going to do any good. So I have this metronome that is pretty loud. And actually, I turn it over most of the time, so it's not quite as loud. But I have some range there. It doesn't actually have a volume wheel or anything like that, but it's basically just a metronome. It's a matrix metronome that I use, and this is the MR 700. I think they're up to at least 900 or something by now. But in any case, finding a metronome that you like the sound of, that was another thing. It wasn't a beep. It was a little bit more of a click, I suppose. I could kind of imagine maybe someone hitting a wood block or something and making that sound. It felt natural enough. But yeah, some of them are kind of like these really, there's a very strong pitch to it. There's a beep to it. I don't like those as much. And I don't like the ones that you just can't hear, obviously. And some of them seem to have a little bit of like almost a delay or a reverb to them. And I don't like those as much either, because then I don't feel as solid about where the beat is. But there are a lot of apps out there, and you just have to find something that works for you. I do like having an actual metronome versus an app, just because it does seem to be louder. I can only turn up my phone volume so much. I can put on headphones and stuff like that, but kind of prefer to have a metronome that can be in the room with me, so I can really have both ears listening to everything, including, of course, the violin, most importantly, or viola or cello, whatever I'm playing. So getting a metronome that we like is the first step. And beyond that, we have to learn how to use it. And I want to emphasize the word learn, because I think a lot of us get intimidated when we just can't magically use the metronome, like turn it on and then suddenly we can play along with it and everything's fine. I don't think anyone has that experience. There are some people who seem to be able to use the metronome a little bit more quickly and easily than others, but it's a skill, like any skill, like holding the bow and playing with good tone or learning how to have good intonation and vibrato and shift and all of this. We're learning skills, right? It's a skill that we need to practice, but first we need to know what we're trying to do. So that's what we'll be talking about. And many of us might find this particular podcast geared a little bit more towards beginners and intermediates, but I do hope that more advanced players and certainly teachers of string instruments as well as other instruments. I think it doesn't have to be just about strings today for sure, but I hope that others will also get some benefit out of this discussion. And I think as far as the more advanced players, hopefully there might be a few ideas that I share a little bit later on that might help you get a little bit more creative with using the metronome. Once we have our metronome, we have to figure out first what it's trying to do for us, probably primarily. I mean, there's a few things, but this first one is the most important because everything else kind of rests upon it, either working or not. So we need to figure out how we can either subdivide the beats or how to hold our note values long enough. So that's what the metronome is really trying to make us just really honest about. So if subdivision and all of this sounds very unfamiliar, let's just start here. So first of all, we have quite a few different time signatures that our pieces might be in. So this is the 4/4 or common time. This is the 2/4, the 3/4, maybe the 6/8, the 9/8, the 3/8, the something more unusual like a 5/8 or a 7/8, or maybe it's a 2/2 or something like that. And this is all telling us the information that we'll need to use with the metronome. The top number is giving us how many beats are in a measure or a bar, depending, measure, bar. Those words are interchangeable. And the bottom number is giving us what type of note value we're counting as the beat. So if it's a 4 on the bottom, then it's a quarter note. It's always going to be a quarter note in that piece that we're counting as the beat. Different notes will add up to a quarter note. And so that, that's the subdivision. So if it's 2 eighth notes adding up to 1 quarter note, that would be a beat, right? But anyway, we'll move on for now. So 4 is the quarter note. A 2 would be a half note. An 8 would be an eighth note. Very rarely, but on occasion I have seen a 16 on the bottom. That would be a 16th note. That's really about it. Maybe I'm forgetting something. I mean, I guess technically we could have perhaps 32 on the bottom, a 32nd note, maybe 64 on the bottom. Yeah. So anyway, most of the time, I think the 4, the 2, or the 8 is the most common on the bottom. So that is our note value that's getting the beat. And then, like I said, the top number is going to be how many beats are in a measure. So if it's like 6/8, we're going to see 6/8 notes in a measure, or at least some note values in that measure that would add up to 6/8 notes. So it doesn't actually have to be eighth notes themselves. Same with 4/4. 4 beats of quarter notes in a measure. It doesn't have to be just 4 quarter notes that we're seeing in that measure. It could be 8 eighth notes, and that would add up to the amount of time of 4 quarter notes, right? So it's all like these fractions, basically. If it's been a while since you did fractions, time to get out the baking tools, and just remember what that all means a little bit with fractions. So once we have an idea of what type of note is getting the beat, and I think quarter note's probably the most common, so we'll just use that as our example. But then we can set our metronome and we can figure out how all either the subdivisions are going to work, or we can think about how all of the longer notes, how long we're going to have to hold them for. So for instance, if we have some eighth notes, but we're counting the quarter note beat, we go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and that's our subdivision. It's just allowing us to see, without having to just guess, where the beats fall when they're not just like if we're counting quarter note beats, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if it's a quarter note, every note I play is just going to be right with this beat, and it's going to last for this beat. And when the next click starts, I'm going to be on my next beat. But if that's our starting point, then even that we need to practice. Sometimes we have this feeling like we're not quite confident that the beat's going to happen or something. And the only time that's happened is when my batteries are running low. But really what the metronome is trying to do for us in just like the grand scheme of things, right, is to give us that internal sense of a beat, to really train that internal sense of a beat. So maybe we just start here with quarter notes and clapping quarter notes. And we're not guessing. We just have a nice feeling of that beat coming around, and we know it's going to be there for us. And then we go to our eighth notes. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And again, we're also very steady, and we're very convinced that the metronome is going to be there for us. We become one with the metronome. And we might have some situations where we have a mix of note values, and often there we might have to break some stuff down in smaller chunks, maybe just do a couple beats at a time or a measure at a time. But this is where we really want to work with the metronome first, is can we subdivide all these different beats? So let's just go through a few other ones to give you a sense for this. So we might have 16th notes, and we're fitting 4 into a quarter note, right? So if we go from our quarter notes to our eighth notes to our 16th notes, one E and a, 2 E and a, right? So in my studio, I like to use food names for these, especially as we're first starting out. And I really like the book. I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but there's a book by Sally O'Reilly called Fiddle Rhythms. And I really like that. And those of you who started maybe with the Suzuki method and the twinkle variations, you might have had some different words to describe the different rhythms. And with my beginners, it's just fun to make up our own rhythms too, make up our own fruit pies and stuff like this. So eighth notes could be apples, 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 according to Sally O'Reilly's book. The 16th notes could be huckleberry, huckleberry. Let's just see how that fits with the metronome. Apples, apples, there's our eighth notes. Huckleberry, 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 huckleberry. So we're just trying to fit these different subdivisions into time here with the metronome. We might have some triplets. So those might be indicated with eighth notes, but then with kind of a stylized, italicized 3 underneath. And that in Sally O'Reilly's book would be chocolate, chocolate, or we could just call it triplet, triplet. So that would be a chocolate, chocolate, triplet, triplet, this kind of feel. We might have some different rhythms that combine a few different note values, like the eighth note with the 2 16th notes. That would be gooseberry or blueberry. Gooseberry, gooseberry, blueberry, blueberry. So first we just need to break these down, and we could go into a whole podcast just talking about this, Rhythm 101, and maybe I'll do that at some point. But if we don't know how these different subdivisions fit into the beat, we're going to have a really hard time with doing other things with the metronome. So like I said, even if you have to break it down to just a beat at a time, we need to figure out how all of these rhythms are going to fit into our beat and really where the beats are falling within the measures. So I'll often, in a more difficult measure, I'll put slash marks up above the notes that the beats fall on. Just basically like the slash that you'd see in a URL, just because I don't want them to look like ones basically, but something to indicate that, okay, that's where I need to see the beat or hear the beat if I'm working with my metronome, and that's where I need to hear the beat, and that's where I need to hear the beat. So I find that's really helpful. And it's helpful for the rhythms that are subdividing the beat. And it's also helpful for the notes, the note values that are going to last longer than a beat. So we can talk about that next here. So, I might put slashes for a dotted half note. So that's 3 beats. Or maybe something that's a little bit more tricky, like a dotted quarter note, which is 1.5 beats, and then is often maybe tied in somehow. It's like a hooked bow with an eighth note or something like that, which is the other half of the beat, and together it makes 2 beats. So where does that eighth note fall? We've got our da, 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 our 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1. Like, where's the and of 2, right? So the metronome helps with these sorts of situations. Ties, very helpful. Maybe we have a whole note tied in with, say, our dotted quarter note. So we have a whole note 4 beats tied in with that dotted quarter, again, 1.5 beats. So for a total of 5.5 beats, right? How are we going to know that 5.5 beats have gone by, right? It takes having that internal metronome really strong, and this external one should definitely help us develop that. So let's try it out just for fun here. It should always be fun. This is a whole note with a dotted quarter note, and then I'll just put an eighth note at the end to cap off our beats here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, la, da. Like, how are we going to know that if we're just sitting there by ourselves without any help? So yeah, being able to hold that 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and there's our 5.5 beats with our little eighth note at the end. It's tough. It's tough, but yeah, that gives us a sense for exactly where that next note after our holds are going to fall. So all those ties, all of those longer notes that are more than whatever we're counting as 1 beat, very helpful. And I do put slashes. Actually, often it's more frequently for the very long notes, especially if there's some kind of like a dotted quarter note or something where it's a incomplete kind of beat structure there. So 1.5 beats, something like that. And also for rests is another time that the metronome is very helpful. Sometimes we just see the squiggles and we're going, I don't even know what that is. I'll just kind of rest for a while. And if we're playing solo and we're truly just playing solo, maybe it doesn't really seem to matter as much. But as soon as we get to the point where we're playing with just one other person, a piano, or certainly if we go and join a group, counting really is king. And we'll find that very quickly. So yeah, putting in those slashes where the rests are we holding for 1.5 beats? Are we holding for half a beat? Are we holding for 3 beats? Yeah, it's just we need to know all of this so that we know when we can actually play. And when we're able to organize our technique, so our melodies, everything that goes into creating our melodies, our bowing, our shifts, when we're able to organize all of this into the beat structure, it just becomes so much more confident. And I encourage my students, just even at the very start of learning a new piece, even if it's slow, just try it with the metronome, because even if it feels overwhelming and we need to work out some of the details like fingerings or bowings or something like that, just having at least one chance initially to understand how the melody has to fit is just so helpful. And especially with orchestral music or anything that you're planning to play with others, which unfortunately or fortunately, depending how we look at it, is going to be a lot of our experience playing bowed stringed instruments. It's just unless we're playing Bach or something, we're just not solo. But even then, we need to have that strong sense of a beat, because with our audience, I think there's a sense of security when the beat is strong. I remember watching this one concert with, it's kind of a showcase I was a part of actually, and there was someone, a couple groups before us, who was just a fabulous kind of Scottish fiddler, and he played this one beautiful air, and it had a lot of ornaments and just interesting kind of intricate moments, but it's like during those moments I felt like the beat kind of wavered quite a bit. And he was young, he was like maybe 14 or something at the time, and he's since gone on to become quite an amazing violinist. But just watching this boy and feeling like, more work with the metronome and this would really polish up nicely, because he was just doing so many amazing things. But that kind of feeling of being unsettled and like, when's this next beat going to come around? I don't even know. It's just, as an audience member, I think many of us have probably experienced that, where it's just feels a little shaky, and then we feel a little bit anxious, or there's just, something that feels not quite right, even if we can't put our finger on it. So we want to start with those little chunks and figure out how to fit our rhythms or rests, longer notes, all of this into the beat. And then I really like to use the feature when we're starting to string multiple different rhythms together. So for the beginners, maybe it's their fruit pies. We're doing apples, apples, huckleberry pie, gooseberry, gooseberry, huckleberry pie. Like, how do we fit that all together, right? Or maybe it's something more advanced and we're getting very syncopated with some more modern music or something like that. I like to use the feature where on my metronome I can change the initial downbeat to a different pitch. So this is like a 4/4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that higher pitch is going to give me that indication of, yes, you got it. You got to the next measure. Good for you. You got to the downbeat. And to not have to second guess, I've got my 3, 4, apple, apple, huckleberry pie, gooseberry, gooseberry, huckleberry pie. Yay! I got there. So stuff like that is really helpful next. And I think all metronomes have some feature like that. On mine, it just shows some little numbers with like a little slider. And other apps and stuff that I've seen, they might actually show the time signature. Like they might show like a 4/4 versus a 2/4 or something like that. A lot of these, you can't really break them. You can just fiddle around with it and figure out that setting. But I do really like that setting for trying to string rhythms along, throughout a passage, throughout a page. I don't like that feature, however, where I'm doing another thing that I think most of us use the metronome for. Probably, maybe we assume it's what the metronome is for in general, and that's why we get so anxious, but it's for building speed. So once it comes time to take a piece up to tempo, we're using our metronome, ratcheting it up, a few beats at a time perhaps or something. And that's when I really like to just go back to just having the solid beat, no other pitches, because I already know how to fit my rhythms in, and I don't want that distraction when I'm just working on developing the ability to play fast enough. So those are some features you'll find on your metronome, and those are just my preferences with how I use them. If you like to have just the solid click the whole time, even when you're working on rhythm, that's fine. If you like to keep that different pitch in there when you're working on speed, that's fine. But if you've been stuck in a rut with the metronome, I would try it the other way if you haven't. I particularly find when I'm working on something that's more modern and syncopated and has a lot of rests, and maybe I'm playing the viola part or something in some kind of quartet that's, just more modern music, I really have enjoyed using that feature on my metronome where the higher pitch comes in on the downbeat. So let's go a little bit more into detail about how we can use the metronome to build up to tempo. I think, like what I mentioned a moment ago, just kind of ratcheting it up a couple clicks at a time can be helpful, but what I find is that we'll hit some sort of a barrier at some point. We'll hit a number that is a little short of our goal that we can't seem to overcome. We need to get to 120, we get to 100, and we just can't seem to go faster. And oftentimes I find that that's a technique problem where we've played too slow for too long. And particularly on the violin, we are able, with the bow, it's very apparent, we're able to play a lot longer bows. We do, it makes sense. We play longer bows when we're playing slower, longer notes. And so then I find that students are trying to still keep a relatively similar type of bowing and mechanics going. And the thing with the bowing arm is when we're using longer bows, we're using more of our bowing arm. We're using a different actual mechanics than we would use if we were using very short bows. And so we kind of just hit this breaking point where we literally can't go any faster. And the students say, I literally can't go any faster. I say, well, yeah, like how you're using your arm, you literally can't go any faster. We need to rework this. And so that's always unfortunate because it feels like a couple steps back, but it really isn't. A lot of the work that we've done at the slower tempo will translate to the faster tempo once we just get a few things worked out. But what I would recommend in general with speed work, and when we can't necessarily take something anywhere close to tempo when we're first learning it, is to kind of attack it from both sides. So the slower tempos are great for working on all the little details, getting the intonation perfect, working on dynamics, working on tone, getting our shifts down, making sure we can hit the notes, all of this business. But then it's really actually kind of detrimental for speed, because with speed, it's almost like we just click over into a new part of our brain that is just on autopilot. And for that, I would recommend, even if it's very sloppy, I've written a few blog posts about this and did an article for Strings Magazine a couple years ago on this topic too. You can check out those if you want to go further into it. But to just play at a tempo. You might think, whoa, how is that possible? Yeah, like I said, it might be really sloppy, but just to put the metronome on or try and play along with a recording that, is up to tempo. And you might only hit half the notes or not even that, but just get the idea for what it's going to take in your technique to get it faster. And then when it comes time to use the metronome and really build speed, it's not going to be so frustrating. You're not going to hit that wall because you've done a little bit, even though it's perhaps, again, very sloppy. You've done a little bit just to give you that hint of what it's going to feel like once you're going fast. And it's a complete brain-body difference, really. Like I said, it feels like we're on autopilot. And as far as reading the music, it feels like we're just like skimming when we're going up to tempo. So, a lot of this stuff that we work on when we're going slow, reading every single note, making sure we get every single articulation, all of this, it just kind of in some ways goes out the window when we're going fast. And it shouldn't like completely go out the window, like we're not doing it at all. But as far as being that aware of every single little detail, it's just hopefully by that point it's more automatic. And that's why a lot of people do say, let's start slow, play it as slow as possible, get everything in there. But I think what they fail to recognize in saying that is that, just to go faster, we really do need to it's like almost playing a different instrument. So we need to attack it a little bit from both sides. And then at that point, using the metronome, it's interesting to jump around to different speeds and not necessarily just go from 54 to 60 to 72 to 80, just a few clicks at a time and hit that wall again, but to go 54 and then to jump all the way up to 100 and then back to 80 and then up to 120. And just, if we're that solid with how we can imagine our rhythms fitting into this beat, can we feel flexible enough to then adjust our technique in the moment? And it's great training for any sort of orchestral situation where you just don't know how fast the conductor is going to take it. You might have been practicing at one tempo the whole time, and then the dress rehearsal comes or even the concert comes and it's faster than you've ever played it before. How many times has that happened to us? So it's important to be really flexible with just how we can think about rhythm, how we can adjust our technique to match. And that's what I would recommend just in general for using the metronome to get faster. It's not always just to get faster. To recognize that it's kind of more holistic than that. It's more flexible than that. And then I would also consider setting the metronome to different note values that are getting the beat. So not just what's in the time signature. If it's 4/4 time, not necessarily just having the beat on the quarter note, but maybe if you're really uncertain if you're subdividing correctly, maybe put it at the eighth note, especially for slower pieces, adagio, largo, some of these beautiful slower Bach movements, for instance. It can even be helpful to set it to even a 16th note beat if it's really slow. And just really, again, trying to be 100% certain that we are fitting our rhythms in appropriately. So for instance, that fruit pie I had before, if I had my apples, huckleberry pie, gooseberry, huckleberry pie. I have to subdivide a lot there, especially for the huckleberries. But if I put that 54 and took it up to 108, I doubled it for the eighth note. Apples, huckleberry pie. Gooseberry, huckleberry pie. Right? So I have to hold the pie out for 2 clicks now, but I really get a sense for where the apples is falling. Apples, right on each click gets a syllable there. And then my huckleberry. So 2 syllables for 1 click, the other 2 syllables for the other click. So it's getting much more specific, and that can be really helpful. It can also feel a little bit stale though, once we're really playing. So the other thing, and my metronome isn't going to go slow enough for this one, this example I've been using, but I could take it down to a beat that is going to be like if I'm in 4/4, instead of having 4 clicks in every measure, I could take it down to where I just have a click on the downbeat and then I have a click on beat 3. So basically, every 2 beats I have a click. And that gives us a little bit more of a flow. So basically taking 4/4 and making it into what we call like cut time. So let's just pretend I can go slow enough here. I'm going to go down to the slowest I can go, which is 40. And I'll do my same fruit pies here. So apples, huckleberry pie. Gooseberry, huckleberry pie. We get a little bit more of a flow with that. We're perhaps not quite as accurate, but it's not about being a robot either. So if we're playing along with someone else, we definitely need to be accurate, but I think there's a little bit of wiggle room there. So that could maybe help us to flow a little bit more. And again, it would help us be a little bit more flexible. We could even take it down to where we just have, this is of course a faster piece probably, but where we just have 1 beat that's sounding per measure. And then that's kind of working us back to that idea of the metronome basically being a tool to help us develop our own internal beat. So if we just hear the first beat and then we have to imagine beat 2, 3, and 4 in our 4/4 measure, we're getting pretty honest with ourselves about, whether or not we have that strong beat or not, whether we can imagine that, or if we just kind of lose it. And then that next beat's going to come around, beat 1 of the next measure. And, are we too fast? Did we run into it? Are we too slow? So that could be really helpful too, as far as just getting a little bit more honest. And it's kind of like the training wheels, where we're slowly taking the training wheels off. Another interesting thing you could do with the metronome is not set it on the actual beats. So this is kind of interesting. Like I could go back to my 54 and I could have this beat going, but instead of intending to play my, let's say, eighth notes with the first eighth note, the 1, being on the beat, I could put the beat on the and. And that can be really helpful if maybe we're tending to cut certain notes a little bit too short. Not uncommon to maybe subdivide the eighth notes and go 1 and, 2 and, 3 and, 4 and it's not even, it should be 1 and, 2 and, right? But to just have that and follow very quickly after the beat happens, not right in between the beats. And so that can be really helpful to just kind of even out, and it's harder. I'll give it a try. 1 and, 2 and, 3 and, 4 and, right? So then we know exactly where those and should go. No excuses anymore. And what about trying to even out some 16th notes? We have a long passage, a few lines of just straight 16th notes. And maybe, let's say, instead of having the beat on the first 16th note of each group, maybe we have the beat on the last 16th note of every 4. And then we know exactly where that one E and where the is falling. Let's try this out. We're really putting me through my paces here today. I hope you guys are trying this along with me. 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and Or I could try it with the huckleberry from the Fiddle Rhythms. Huckleberry, 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 huckleberry. So we know exactly where the last 16th note is falling. What about if it was on the second 16th note? I mean, you get the idea. It can be a lot more creative than we think when we're just hearing this and it just feels so kind of stale and either we're right or we're wrong. In that process of getting better and more solid with our rhythms and feeling the beat, we can have a lot more fun than I think we realize. Another thing that's fun is there is an app by Warchel, the folks who make the Warchel strings, Warchel. You can go and check that out. I'll put a link in the show notes, but there's a metronome app where you can adjust the beat to not come around perfectly evenly. And this is simulating that idea of playing with others. And even if they're really strong players, again, we're not robots. So we might have just a slight variation in exactly when that beat's coming around. And working with a tool like that helps us, again, just become more flexible and able to adjust in the moment, which is what we're always doing. Music happens in the moment. So that can be a really interesting tool to use, maybe not on a daily basis, but certainly from time to time. Also, for more advanced usage with metronome apps and stuff, there are some apps that allow you to either select or randomly mute certain beats. And I think especially they randomly mute certain beats. So just imagine, you're hearing the metronome click and then there's just no click once. And then maybe there's another click and then there's 2 clicks that are gone or something like that. It really helps us to internalize that beat. And again, it's kind of the training wheels idea, just slowly getting us more and more confident on our own. One that I know of that allows us to do this is called Time Guru. And another feature that's interesting that I've found on a few apps, most notably Dr. Betotte, Bettotte. And that is where the metronome, you can program it to gradually speed up over time. And that would be very interesting to use when you're working with tempo. Just maybe it just kind of catches you off guard and before you know it, you're playing faster. So those are some interesting features that, of course, my metronome doesn't have, but are benefits of getting an app. And the ones I mentioned, they're not free, but they're not that expensive either. The Time Guru, it's about $2-3 depending on what kind of phone you have. The Dr. Betotte is almost $10, so that's a little bit more expensive, but still less expensive than an actual metronome. And the Warchel app that I mentioned earlier, I can't remember if that one was free or just a couple dollars. It's been a while since I downloaded that one. So these are some other features that you might seek out and enjoy with some of the apps at least. And again, just kind of showing us how flexible and creative we can be with this metronome. It really doesn't have to just be a taskmaster like I think many of us assume it is. And there's a few features. I don't know if anyone knows if there's an app that can do this, but I've always thought that a way to pre-program a rallentando would be very nice on a metronome. And I just find that sometimes my students, they have trouble maybe feeling that if they're more on the beginner side. And if the metronome could just kind of dictate, this is how we're going to slow down. I think that would be quite an advanced metronome, but I think that that would be a useful idea to try and work out. Anyway, I don't know how hard that would be. It seems complex, but let me know if you come across something like that out there. And then also to have a way to program time signatures for a piece that has meter changes, I think would be really interesting. So when I was mentioning earlier, I have that function on my metronome where I can put the different sounding click on the downbeat. Well, what about a piece that's going from 3/4 to 4/4, something like that? These pieces with meter changes, I think when we're trying to string along our rhythms and want to be honest with ourselves, it'd be really helpful to have that ability to know 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, and to know where those are. It's definitely not like it's something we can't work around, but that would be really interesting as well. And maybe, again, on the more difficult side to program, I don't really know. That's not my expertise. But if you do come across something that has those kind of features out there, definitely send me an email or, message me, and I'd love to know about it. And then I wanted to offer some suggestions for supplemental material you can work on for rhythms and metronome work specifically. One is obviously Fiddle Rhythms, which I've been mentioning, by Sally O'Reilly. She goes through not only the ones that I mentioned, but many of the common rhythms. I would say most of the common rhythms we come across. She's got some that are more in 6/8 and different time signatures. She's even got an interesting section towards the back that has some odd time signatures like the 7/8 and stuff like that. And sort of each page starts off with very basic exercises, just, 1 line, 2 lines, and then towards the bottom of each page, she gives a couple excerpts from either the classical repertoire or a fiddle tune or something that she's created that contains those rhythms. And she offers metronome markings, some suggestions for metronome markings that you can use to play the pieces. And as the book goes through, she starts to combine the different rhythms a little bit more frequently. In the beginning, if we're all doing apples, most everything is just eighth notes or maybe a couple quarter notes thrown in there. And down the road, it gets much more elaborate. So that's a really good resource, I would say, for maybe not the strict beginner, but someone who has a little bit of technique under their belt and is still kind of in the beginner phase as far as rhythms goes, as well as through more of an intermediate level. I also really recommend the sonata repertoire for working on rhythms, particularly maybe the 19 Mozart sonatas. There is just so much counting involved. So not as much for maybe tempo work and working on speed and stuff with the metronome, but definitely for rhythm work. I find that those can be very challenging. And there are some certain ones that have more ornaments than others, and trying to figure out not only the rhythms, but also how to fit in the ornaments within the rhythms. And being a sonata, there's a little bit more give and take between the violin and the piano. So, there's more counting of rests. There's more we're playing more of a support role in some sections versus a soloistic role. So that can provide a little bit more of a challenge for counting, and definitely where we definitely need to count. So I definitely recommend, really any sonatas or modern music as well. But the 19 Mozart sonatas. And what's nice about them as well is there's a few spots here and there where they might climb into higher positions, but for the most part, it's all first and third position, maybe a little bit of second position. So really something that is doable for intermediate level. And then, we can certainly get more fancy with it. And people who are more advanced can still get a lot out of those as well. Mozart's Mozart. But those are helpful. And then, like I said, modern music, you could just type in any sort of pop tune that you'd want to play or that you've heard, and you'd get lots of experience working, particularly with syncopation. If it's any sort of a piece that it was meant for a vocalist originally. I had a student recently, she was working on like some Van Morrison and stuff like that. And it's just, the melody sounds so simple when he's singing it, but then as soon as we see what the sheet music actually looks like and the syncopation, it's like, whoa, how do we figure this out? We really have to break it down. So those are some good avenues to practice. And then for speed and tempo work, you really can't beat Vivaldi and Bach. There are so many, particularly for maybe students that are, again, more intermediate. I think Vivaldi's ideal. And you're not going to find as many sort of tricky rhythms. It's just a lot of, he's kind of the king of the motif, right? So you're going to find a lot of just like running 16th notes or just some kind of rhythm that repeats itself, and maybe moving around the neck or something a little bit. But again, you're not generally going to go higher than third position. So that can be really attainable. to people who aren't necessarily that advanced yet. And then, of course, the Bach. I mean, whether we're working with the solo Bach partitas and sonatas, I mean, they're kind of all over the map as far as difficulty, but there's just going to be a lot of opportunities, really, in Baroque music in general. I mean, we could look at Handel and Corelli and Tartini, some of these other composers, and find a lot of material where it's very scale and arpeggio oriented, and you just can kind of work up the speed. I mean, work up to your allegro, your presto, and the rhythms themselves aren't quite as tricky. So it's a little bit more achievable as far as just being able to know what you're after and then to just work on getting it faster. And then if classical music isn't so much of your thing and you want to try fiddling, obviously fiddle music has tons of rhythms, often not that complex, but we definitely need to keep up the pace unless we're doing some slow air waltz or something. So you can definitely find a lot of opportunities to practice rhythms in fiddle music, and those can be really fun to work up. So if you're a little bit hesitant to use the metronome and work with the metronome, then maybe fiddling is the way to go, and you can get your feet wet and feel more confident. All right, so I hope this has been helpful. Let's just do a quick recap here, some things that you can take away and immediately apply to your practice, I hope. And so first would be just, do we know where the beats are within the piece we're trying to play? If that is a little shaky, then that's where we need to start. We need to know where the beats are falling and how we need to subdivide some of the measures, what notes we need to hold longer, and we might need to practice those even just broken down to a beat at a time and to figure out how that's going to fit. So when you're just working at a beat at a time, you could literally just take that beat. Maybe it's something a little bit more tricky, like I mentioned the gooseberry, or the opposite of that in the Sally O'Reilly book, Fiddle Rhythms, is the butterscotch. So let's say we're just trying to work on some butterscotch or some gooseberry, or maybe back to back. That's even more tricky. Gooseberry. Can we get off of it and hear that next beat clearly, right? Gooseberry, click. Gooseberry, click. Make sure that we're solid with that. And that's where we work, and we want to feel good about that. It's a building process, so it could take some time. It could take a few weeks to get good at that. But that's where we need to start there. And then can we string them along? Maybe a measure at a time. If that's the case, can we maybe set our metronome where we can hear that higher pitched click? And then we'll go back to my fruit pie from earlier here. So here's the beat. 1, 2, 3, 4, apples, apples, huckleberry pie. Yay, there's the higher click. I didn't go over. My pie would have lasted for that final click, and then I'm off. Maybe I could do that next measure that we were talking about earlier. 1, 2, 3, 4, gooseberry, gooseberry, huckleberry pie. Yay! Give yourself a yay. You're off at the right time. We're not dragging on, or you didn't finish too soon, or, this is just where we need to start. And then we're stringing more and more measures into phrases, into pages, into pieces. And maybe it's at a slow tempo. Then maybe we try putting the beat on different types of note values, maybe on shorter note values like the eighth notes versus the quarter notes, maybe on longer note values like the half notes versus the quarter notes. And like I mentioned earlier, then we're either getting much more accurate with how we're subdividing, or we're allowing ourselves to let go of the training wheels a little bit, and also to feel more flow if we're having beats coming around less frequently. And then maybe we're working on tempo, and with tempo, again, being flexible with not just a couple beats faster, but sometimes going slower and then faster and then a little slower and then much faster and then much slower, and just getting really flexible with being able to understand how our rhythms are going to fit. And anytime we go to a new tempo, we just always want to take a moment to vocalize it, to think it through, to imagine how it's going to sound, and then we're going to be much more confident. I find with my students who really struggle, they just, again, assume maybe that they need to know how to do this somehow, and they kind of maybe skip that step sometimes, and they just jump in with the violin or the viola and then get very frustrated. But if we just take a moment to recognize that, hey, maybe we just don't really even know what we're trying for. We can't vocalize along with it. We have no idea how we're supposed to fit in. Well, yeah, of course, that's where we want to back up to. We want to just be able to understand intellectually how this is going to work and imagine how it's going to work, feel how it's going to work, and then we grab our instrument and we're much more successful. Oftentimes successful on the first try at that point. We have to kind of just do that work, and it's still practice. You don't have to have your instrument in your hand to be practicing. There's so many other ways. And we really have to get the mind practicing first, and then the body can follow. So who would have thought we could spend 45 minutes talking about metronomes, but I hope you stuck there with me. And if you did, congratulations. I know it can be a little bit of a dry subject, but just think about all the drummers out there and just all the people who are like percussionists, and this is what they live and breathe. So it can be enjoyable. These folks have obviously devoted their lives to rhythm, and we go to a concert and we feel the beat. We're wanting to dance. This is because of the rhythm. So even though when we oftentimes think about bowed strings, we think about these beautiful soaring melodies, rhythm is really our most fundamental aspect of music. I mean, we could just get some guy sitting out on the beach, and this happens around here where I live, a single drum, and he's just drumming like a heartbeat. And that's music. To really do that well takes some skill. It's something to practice and to recognize that this is just as important as being able to play with vibrato and to do all the fancier stuff. So I hope it's been helpful, and please let me know if you have any questions or challenges or ideas for just the podcast in general or this episode. If you'd like a follow-up on any aspect of anything I've talked about, please let me know. You can send me an email, laurel@laurelthomsen.com. I will put that in the show notes. And to help showcase how much fun we can have once we get our rhythms and tempos down, at the very end of the episode, I'll be sharing a track called Surefire Way of Taking, which Dan Frechette and I released on our album New Disguise back in 2015. This is a song that Dan wrote and I arranged the violin part for. We also have some wonderful guests joining us on the track. We have this wonderful woman, Patty Maxine, who's playing lap slide guitar. So you'll hear kind of the twang of that. And you'll also hear some drums by a wonderful drummer, Jimmy Norris. He lives and breathes rhythms. He's incredible to watch. And then we have some bass playing by a lovely lady named Tracy Parker. In the violin arrangement, you'll hear these little rhythmic motifs I created. I wanted to have a part that could stay in the mix during the vocals and wouldn't be distracting, but could kind of bounce off of the vocals and the other instruments, just add to this kind of peppy mood. It's a little bit of a jazzy track. It has a little bit of a swing feel. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing anything that was too long and sustained that would sort of draw attention to itself. So I really just in playing this part, and I love playing this piece. Well, not as much these days since the pandemic, but pre-pandemic days, we would play it almost every show and was always one of our crowd pleasers, I suppose. So really a fun part to play, but just, technically just I have to execute these really quick, just almost like with my bow fingers, just a tiny little stroke and just pop in, pop out. And so that part's really fun. And then for the solo, I was trying to emulate a brass instrument, a woodwind instrument, maybe a clarinet, some instrument that I feel is a little bit more common in this type of music versus a violin. And I think the main difference that I feel with how one of those instruments might create a solo is that they physically have to breathe. So there's a lot of sensibility around the phrasing and maybe shorter phrases versus, a typical violinist, I mean, we could just fly all over the place. The bow is continuous. We can just keep bowing back and forth. But it just didn't sound right when I was trying that kind of an approach. I really felt like I wanted to lean into some of these notes and build up the momentum and build up the excitement of that solo with the use of space to some degree, and these, again, shorter motifs. And so that was an interesting part to create. And it's just, it's always really fascinating what comes out when you're given a part to work with. And in this case, free reign, other than Dan, of course, needing to be happy with it as well. But definitely a lot more rhythm than a typical soaring, beautiful melody violin part. It's definitely a fun piece to play. So I hope you enjoy it. It'll be right at the end. And if you do enjoy the track and you want to hear it again, other than scrolling to the end of this podcast, unfortunately, it's not on any streaming platforms at the moment, but you can definitely buy a physical copy of that album from my website, from danandlaurel.ca as well, in our store. And you can also get a download. And if you go to my website and go to the media tab and the audio tab, then you'll be able to listen to it there, and as well as download it. So thank you so much. And as you've probably noticed, I don't have any ads on the podcast, and hope you appreciate that. I know it can be a little tedious to click through all of the sponsors on a lot of podcasts, but this is how these podcasters make their living, and I make my living in other ways, teaching and performing. So the podcast is a labor of love, yet in order for me to keep doing the podcast and spending time doing the podcast, it is helpful to get a little bit of help. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean money. A few free ways you could support me and the podcast would be just to subscribe to it wherever you listen, or possibly on a few different platforms, just, so people there, they see that, oh, this is a popular podcast. The algorithms and all this business, right? As well as to rate it and review it, hopefully with a nice review. I know that Apple iTunes allows you to rate and review, and I have some really nice reviews over there. Thank you. And I believe that Spotify has recently allowed people to, I'm not sure if you can review it there, but at least to rate it. I'm a little bit less familiar with Spotify. It's a little newer to me. So anyhow, there are other places as well that you might find the podcast, and it would be great to get your ratings and reviews there. Beyond that, I do have a donations link on my website. So if you go to laurelthomsen.com and click on the Violin Geek tab, there's a little donate button there. And it's for both the podcast and for my blog, both labors of love. So if you'd like to send me a little donation, I do appreciate that. And it helps me feel like I can set aside the time to spend on recording these and writing the posts, which does take time. And I would like to do it more frequently. So those are some ways to support me, as well as, of course, downloading a CD or signing up for one of my courses. I have a vibrato course, which, gosh, has like over 2,000 students now. It's quite incredible, and I'm very grateful that everyone's enjoying that who's a part of it. And I also have a couple courses I did well over a decade ago now with Strings Magazine, but it's still all relevant information. There's a bowing course going from how to set up your bow hold with your natural anatomy to bowing mechanics and all the different strokes, troubleshooting. And then I also have a left-hand course that I did through Strings Magazine. So those are all on my website. The links to those, you can find them underneath the teaching tab. And then, of course, I teach privately. And I was teaching online well before the pandemic started. It's been well over a decade now that I've had most of my students actually online. So if you're looking to polish up on some of your technique, I particularly enjoy that. I like working with adult students and students of all ages really, but people who are dedicated, and particularly if you have a problem that you're having a hard time solving. I really like troubleshooting. I'm determined to figure it out. So if anything has you in pain or has you frustrated, I might be your person, because I really enjoy working with students and getting them to the other side of those issues. We have a lot of fun along the way, and it's just, sometimes it's very fascinating how it all fits together. And to get to the other side of that is so rewarding. It feels really good. I also like working with students who maybe are experiencing some performance anxiety, and I have a background in some different mind-body techniques to help that. So I am here to be of service. If you need it, please contact me. Well, that's it for today, and I will be back soon with some guests that I'm lining up here. Should be quite fun in the next few months, as well as I'm going to be sharing some new music videos and thus the tracks from After the Fire. Some more of those. We'll get Dan back here to talk about some of these songs some more. And I'm always open to new suggestions and questions that you want to have answered on the podcast as well. If it's not a great podcast topic, I might also do it in the blog as well. If you go there, the Violin Geek blog is on my website under the Violin Geek tab. You'll find quite a few student questions that came in either through the podcast or my private studio that may be answering questions that you have. So you can head there as well. All right, thank you so much for listening, and until next time, happy practicing.
But I've got that surefire way you take to that little heart of mine. It's breaking, I'm heart's taking, shaking, make myself get down. Got that old standby, just wait for flirtation with my seat now. Can't guarantee you won't run you round. And I got that old campfire swaying, and I'm drunk, but I'm still playing. I'm giving into the glare behind the dawn. And I'm gonna write her an old-time love line, singing in a song 1,000 times. Pick up 4 times I put her on. Well, she is just a dreamer, I'm just a coffee and beat a creamer. I'm literally just hoping to get by. She's had many years going crazy, being treated just like a lady. I'll take on the ground, my money's tied. Got that old campfire swinging, and I'm drunk, but I'm still playing. I'm caving into the glare behind the dawn. And I'm gonna write her an old-time love line, sing it in a song 1,000 times. Pick up 4 times I put her on. Yeah. Shaking, make myself get down. Got that old standby, just wait for a new flirtation with my savior. Can't guarantee you won't run you round. But I got that old campfire swaying, and I'm drunk, but I'm still playing. I'm caving into the glare behind the dawn. And I'm gonna write her an old-time love line, sing it in a song 1,000 times. Pick up 4 times up